how do you think about Bitcoin from a valuation perspective, right? In terms of being too high or too low, right? There's a couple different models out there, right? There's the stock to flow, which, just to remind people, that's where you look at the amount of existing Bitcoin relative to the amount of newly produced Bitcoin, and you compare it to other assets. There's Metcalfe's law, right? There's sort of the networking effect as more people join the Bitcoin network and Bitcoin itself become more valuable. There's using gold as a proxy, right, as a percentage of gold's overall market. How do you think about those, or do you when you think about value in Bitcoin?
I think stock to flow is a really interesting model. I am still not entirely sure about it. It's certainly been very predictive, and it's interesting just to observe how predictive it has been. The way I think about it is I see that there are largely four valuation models that people have used for Bitcoin over time, in my observation, following this market for the last decade. The first is that, and I want to assign a target price to each of these valuation models so you can kind of ballpark think about where Bitcoin should be if you believed each of these models. The first one is that Bitcoin is basically the tulip mania. It's a huge bubble. It's completely irrational. Bitcoin has no comparative advantage to anything else. Why does it exist? And if you believe that, then the long-term target price for Bitcoin is obviously zero. The second model is that, and this is the model I think people held for quite a long time until the last couple of years, is that Bitcoin, it's an interesting technology and there's something to it, but it has a limited addressable market. It's only interesting to geeks and libertarians and people who want to do things in the gray market. And if you believe that model for Bitcoin, you'd think that its target price would be somewhere in the ballpark of 10,000, maybe on the higher end to 100,000, something like that. The addressable market is tech people, essentially, and libertarians. The third valuation model I have is that, and that I've observed, is that Bitcoin is digital gold. It's a monetary good, and its closest cousin is gold. It's a non-sovereign store of value. It's a place to store value that's not controlled by any sovereign, by any nation state. And if you recognize it as superior to gold, the attributes it has as money are superior to gold's attributes. So for instance, it's much easier to transport Bitcoin and to transmit it over the wire. Then you look at gold's market capitalization, which is approximately 10 trillion, and you could easily slap a target price on Bitcoin of 500,000, which gets Bitcoin to that same capitalization. And if you believe it's superior to gold, as I do, I think it's 10x or 100x superior to gold, I think you could easily see valuation from 500,000 to maybe a couple million. And then the final valuation model is Bitcoin as a reserve currency, the global reserve currency. And it takes on the role that gold had in the 19th century, where it's the final means of settlement for banks and nation states to settle trade between each other and settle accounts between each other. And if you believe that valuation model, then I think you can go into the tens of millions per Bitcoin, because it becomes the global means of savings, and it's going to suck liquidity out of every major market. It's going to take liquidity out of government bonds. It's going to take it drastically out of gold. It's going to pull it out of real estate. So for instance, in Vancouver, Washington, which is near where I live, a lot of Chinese investors want to have some of their assets out of the country as a safe haven. What's a good safe haven? Vancouver. They can move to Canada and they can have some savings when they arrive. All of that's going to get blown away. Why would you have a house that stays empty in Vancouver when you can have it in Bitcoin? So if you believe that Bitcoin is going to become eventually the reserve currency of the world, as I do, then you get very, very high target numbers for Bitcoin.
Bitcoin demonetizes other assets, right? Real estate, as you point out, art, as you're probably aware, most privately owned art sits in just warehouses, right? Mostly in Switzerland for tax reasons. No one's looking at them. Most of it's bought anonymously, so people aren't even getting credit for owning the art, right? So it's clearly a store of value. And I could see the monetary premium getting slowly diminished out of those assets, where, let's say, art appreciates, but the rate of appreciation goes from being double digits to mid single digits, right? Where it's almost not noticeable this demonetization. But what I hear you talking about becomes disruptive to the monetary system globally, right? And it seems to me, I'm doing too much talking, that Bitcoin, at least in the United States, is in a great place from a regulatory standpoint, right? We have banks are allowed to do it, right? Anchorage has been designated the first digital bank. So I feel like we have this runway from now until that point, which we start becoming, I'm using Bitcoin as a threat. But how do you think about that regulatory risk when you combine that with your end game?
The way I think about it is, how does Bitcoin, or can Bitcoin get enough regulatory capture before it's seen as a threat? And I think some nation states are getting that first inkling that, hey, this might be a threat to our monetary policy if the world's savings start flowing into something that we can't inflate and something that we can't control. How do we control our own monetary policy? And there was an article in the Wall Street Journal a few years ago where they said, well, maybe the biggest threat is that Bitcoin doesn't go up, but that it keeps going up and it keeps going up. And then, hey, we as central bankers thinking about monetary policy, we've lost control. And the way I think about this is kind of the same way I think about Uber as a company. Uber is a company that would go into markets where the local government and the established players were very antagonistic to Uber. And, the taxi lobby would lobby the local city government and say, look, we don't want Uber to come in and completely disrupt our business. And they were very cozy with local governments. So local governments were typically very antagonistic to Uber. And what Uber would do is just barge into this city and say, okay, we're providing this app here, we're hiring a bunch of drivers, users really love it, they start using it. And you get this entrenched lobby which starts saying, hey, you can't attack this company, this benefits us, we want this here. And I think the same thing is true of Bitcoin. We're starting to see some of that capture where, imagine you're a congressman and 4 years from now, 20% of your constituency owns Bitcoin, and you start saying, well, maybe we should regulate this thing or ban it. Well, you're going to get a lot of pushback. So I think in the Western democracies, the question is whether we get to that point of regulatory capture before nation states begin to crack down. And I see really, really positive signs in that regard. We have a senator who's a very pro-Bitcoin from Wyoming. I think we're going to see several more congressmen in the next election, and then one election hence from that, a lot more, because we're really transitioning from Bitcoin being this niche thing to being very widespread and owned by a lot of people in the US. And when you have a lot of people with their savings in something, that's a natural protection, a natural lobby. And throw in the fact that corporations are now getting into Bitcoin, large funds. These institutions have much more lobbying power than the average person. They don't want their balance sheet to be blown away by a government doing something stupid. It's kind of like, it would be very difficult for a government to outlaw 401ks right now. You just can't do that. So the big question to me is, do we make that transition quickly enough? I am optimistic.